This Soviet-era submarine was once a military threat. Today, it's a tourist attraction. In the 1980s, millions of people protested against new nuclear weapons. An entire generation lived in fear. At the end of the Cold War, thousands of nuclear weapons were withdrawn from Europe. And today, top-secret bases and storage facilities lie abandoned. These bunkers in a former American missile base in Germany once housed cruise missiles. The site now hosts a popular open-air electronic music festival. The danger of nuclear conflict appears to have passed. But now, new nuclear weapons destined for Europe are being tested in the U.S.
Nuclear war is more likely now than it was at the height of the Cold War.
And the nuclear problem has not gone away. It's changed. It's become something new and different. Some analysts call this the second nuclear age.
We're facing the most dangerous military and especially nuclear security situation in Europe today since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Currently, there's talk of both a German and of a European nuclear weapon. If you ask me, a German bomb would be dangerous nonsense, but we may find ourselves discussing a European one in the next few years.
This is the village of Büchel in western Germany. Nearby is a German Air Force base where some 20 B-61 American nuclear bombs are said to be stored, as part of a NATO weapons sharing arrangement. Nuclear weapons expert Hans Christensen works for the Federation of American Scientists and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. Christensen is convinced the devices are stored here, devices that could be deployed against enemy forces.
There are still tactical nuclear weapons, yes. Only gravity bombs delivered by fighter jet aircraft. They are the last remnant of what used to be an enormous inventory of about 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons. But they're still here, and about 150 of them, but only that one kind of air-delivered gravity bombs.
If a conflict arose, these weapons could also be delivered by German Air Force planes.
Americans have bases in Europe, but there are also 4 countries in Europe that have host base arrangement, as they call it. They call it a nuclear sharing arrangement. Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and possibly Turkey. So those countries are the ones who sort of serve a pseudo-nuclear strike role where their aircraft would be equipped and handed over nuclear weapons in times of war.
Until just a few years ago, all political parties in the German Bundestag had been calling for the nuclear weapons to be removed. These NATO fighter jets are on patrol over the Baltic states. Their mission is to intercept any Russian military aircraft that approach NATO airspace without warning. A number of participants at the annual Munich Security Conference are concerned about growing tensions between East and West. The conference chairman is Professor Wolfgang Ischinger.
Since the Ukraine crisis, that is, since 2014, we've seen a massive increase in, let's say, incidents. Fortunately, these have not led to a real confrontation so far. These incidents have taken place over the North Sea, the Baltic, and the Black Sea. They've involved Western and Russian warships and military aircraft.
These Russian aircraft over the North Sea were filmed by the British Royal Air Force. More and more NATO aircraft are taking part in interception missions, including Bundeswehr planes. Germany is making a substantial contribution to NATO's program to help protect the Baltic states. But such busy skies are not without risk.
Imagine what would happen if, for example, a Russian military aircraft crossed the border, either by accident or deliberately, and was shot down by Western or American forces. There's a big danger such an incident could lead to an escalation that quickly spirals out of control. So the tensions present here in Europe today are a major cause for concern.
These US B-52 bombers are preparing to take part in a training exercise in the Baltic states. Many see this deployment as a message to Russia. And it isn't the only message.
We've seen types of exercises that we haven't seen since the Cold War, where American B-52 bombers fly up over the North Pole to their launch points for nuclear cruise missiles and then return to their bases in the United States. Those kind of strike exercises were not done since the 1980s.
It seems as though we've returned to the old game of cat and mouse that was common during the Cold War. The situation reminds Australian anti-nuclear activist and author Helen Caldicott of a time when the US and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear confrontation.
Well, I got to know Robert McNamara quite well, who was the Secretary of Defence and was in the Oval Office with Jack Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said to me, "Helen, you don't know how close we came to within 3 minutes," quote unquote. I think the situation today could well be compatible with that.
Decisions to launch a nuclear strike need to be made quickly. And then there are the crews who would actually launch the missiles. Caldicott has heard some alarming reports.
The men in the missile silos in America, they're called Minutemen because they have minutes to decide. They're aged 18 to 26. Like Pavlovian dogs, yes sir, no sir, press the button sir. They're each armed with a pistol, one to shoot the other if one shows signs of deviant behaviour, but the deviant one might shoot the other one. Recently it's been determined that many of those men are taking LSD, not in their missile silos, but beforehand, and having wild psychological experiences and loving it. They're taking marijuana, cocaine and the like.
Caldicott thinks a nuclear strike could be launched by mistake. Here, Wolfgang Ischinger meets Dmitry Trenin, a former senior Soviet army officer who took part in disarmament negotiations with the US. Both experts are concerned a new Cold War may be in the works.
A conflict may arise out of a military collision in places like Syria and escalate all the way to the nuclear level in some scenarios and could affect Europe in other scenarios.
The election of Donald Trump further complicated the situation. The president has sharply criticized NATO and even threatened to pull the US out of the alliance. Shortly after Trump was elected, security policy experts in Germany began reviewing the possible consequences of the U.S. defense umbrella becoming less reliable. Some have said that if Washington is no longer willing to defend Europe, then perhaps Germany should develop its own nuclear weapons.
I was surprised when that debate came up in Germany, because here, nuclear options have been strictly taboo.
Back in the 1980s, millions of Germans took to the streets to protest NATO preparations for deploying new nuclear missiles in Europe to counter a Soviet threat. Christian Hacke is a prominent German political scientist. He has written an essay arguing that the country should lift the nuclear taboo.
Wir müssen einfach klar machen.
It needs to be made clear that Germany as a nuclear power would help strengthen the free Western world. It would support NATO and liberal democracies. And we need to explain that this would not be directed against any other state. It would be purely defensive, a deterrent that would enhance our security, which is essential. It's not just about war and peace, it's also about protecting our country from blackmail in crisis situations.
Would nuclear weapons really provide more security for Germany? So far, the government is not debating this question. But Hacke has ideas on how a German nuclear deterrent might function.
We could develop mobile medium-range missiles that have nuclear warheads. That would provide low-level deterrence at a relatively low cost. Another option would be to use nuclear-capable aircraft. The third option would be to use conventional submarines equipped with nuclear weapons.
If Germany were to build such weapons, it would create huge security problems in Europe. The Russians would feel seriously threatened, not least because of their experience in World War II.
I'd really like to emphasize that a German nuclear option would not be directed against Russia. It would be part of an all-round defensive strategy.
A German nuclear weapons program would cost taxpayers several billion euros per year. And it would create legal problems. Germany renounced the development of nuclear weapons as part of the 1994 Power Treaty that led to unification.
It would be a violation of our obligations if Germany were to have its finger on a nuclear trigger. That would be completely unacceptable.
No one would trust Germany with a bomb anyway, with Germany's history.
But what about the future of the U.S. nuclear program? This is the facility in the Nevada desert at which the Pentagon develops and tests weapons. Right now, experts are working on the B-61 Mod 12, the latest version of a tactical and strategic nuclear weapon. It's an expensive project. The budget for 2019 alone is estimated to be about $254 million. The B-61 can be deployed with a number of military aircraft, including German Tornado fighter bombers. Adaptation of those aircraft was scheduled for 2019. PA-200 integration refers to the Tornado A-200.
In about 5-8 years, there will be a new type of weapon, more advanced, that's going to come back to Germany and be deployed here at Bugel. But aircraft have to be configured for that type of aircraft, for that type of weapon. It's called the B-61-12. The Tornado is right now undergoing flight tests in the United States to be able to deliver this weapon.
German Tornadoes on a U.S. facility. But German military aircraft being outfitted with new U.S. nuclear weapons could have far-reaching consequences. Maxwell Downman works for the London-based think tank BASIC, which supports nuclear disarmament. He warns of possible dangers.
The first place Russian missiles would go would be the B-61 sites. There are so many hurdles for these things getting off the ground. You would need to load the planes with the bombs because the planes and the bombs aren't together. These would need to take off then. This is all presuming that Russian missiles are coming in. Then once they're flying, you would need to refuel them in air, and then you would need to fly them into Russian airspace, past Russian ballistic missile defense before dropping freefall bombs. Compare that to firing a missile. There's huge risks with these things, and they realistically would never get off the ground.
And some experts say that the aircraft could be easily targeted while they're refueling. So why would Germany's Air Force want to use nuclear weapons at all?
On the one hand, we have to make an appropriate conventional contribution so that we can continue to have an influence on policy. But we must also be prepared to bear the burden, and it is a burden, of having nuclear weapons stationed on our territory, or, if necessary, delivered by our aircraft. But it's extremely important to understand this situation as part of our overall nuclear strategy and our ability to help shape policy within the NATO alliance.
In short, Germany can continue to have a say in NATO's nuclear strategy only if it's prepared to use these weapons. This also applies to nuclear weapons modernization programs. There are several NATO member states that say existing stocks of weapons are outdated and need to be replaced. Hans Christensen points out this process is already underway.
As far as we can figure out, the increased accuracy is about 3 times better than it is with the existing weapons. Now, what that means is that not only can you strike targets, facilities much more effectively, but you can also choose lower explosive yield settings for an attack that today requires a much higher yield setting. So that's more usable, it's less radioactive fallout, so it's a concern that we're making nuclear weapons more usable.
This weapon can be employed in ways its predecessor could not be. And Russia will see that and say, fine, if the West is doing this, then we also want to modernize and improve our weapons.
That could create a new arms race, which in turn could lead to a new Cold War. Several experts think this is now a distinct possibility. U.S. President Donald Trump announced his plans regarding nuclear policy at his 2018 State of the Union address.
As part of our defense, we must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression by any other nation or anyone else.
Trump has made clear that the U.S. reserves the right to launch a deterrent nuclear first strike.
Well, the United States is in the early phase of a complete overhaul of its nuclear arsenal. And we're talking about everything. We're talking about all delivery systems, all warheads, nuclear infrastructure, the factories, nuclear command and control system. So it's a huge undertaking.
In fact, it's one of the largest projects of its kind. A report compiled by the Congressional Budget Office puts the total cost at $1.2 trillion as of 2017. But it seems likely that the Pentagon's weapons modernization program will be even more expensive than that. By comparison, in 2018, Germany spent just over 38 billion euros on defense. The U.S. plans to modernize nuclear attack submarines, command and control centers for land-based nuclear missiles, and nuclear-capable aircraft and cruise missiles. Why is the U.S. spending all this money? This is the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. Dr. Brad Roberts is director of the laboratory's Center for Global Security Research. Roberts was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. He explains why the Pentagon wants to upgrade its weapons.
So the alternative to modernization is unilateral disarmament. We have postponed any decision because they're costly and politically very divisive. We've postponed any decision about the modernization of our nuclear forces for decades. The newest U.S. nuclear weapon in the arsenal went in 1991. There is no weapon that was intended to have a shelf life of more than 20 or 25 years.
The U.S. is not only developing new kinds of nuclear weapons, it's also devising new strategies in which those weapons might be used. To some, that is a frightening proposition.
So is war again thinkable? It was not thinkable in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when nuclear war became the problem of Armageddon, the problem of the end of human history. And it's possible that today we have one or two or three actors who believe that a nuclear war can be won because it can be kept limited, because we will back down when they employ nuclear weapons on a limited basis. And if they believe it can be kept limited and can be won, then it can be fought.
But high-yield nuclear weapons are not appropriate for those limited sorts of conflicts. So the U.S. is designing a range of less powerful short-range weapons. These are also part of the modernization program.
In part, the answer is yes, we do need some new weapons. Some of the targets we might want to hit in this kind of environment can be destroyed with small nuclear weapons that would minimize damage to other things, what we call collateral damage, we could significantly reduce.
NATO has deployed these kinds of weapons before. Until 1992, nuclear artillery shells were stored at this facility in Roishain in central Germany. These former Bundeswehr officers were stationed at the storage site. Bert Beckmann was commander of a guard unit.
No Germans were allowed inside. That was strictly forbidden. And we really didn't know what was going on in there. It truly was top secret.
Your job, I guess, was to be ready if the Soviet army would come across the hill, right?
Yeah.
It was about nuclear battle in Europe.
We explained to our troops again and again that Germany was the enemy's target. If war were to break out, Germany would be annihilated. So the better prepared we were to defend ourselves, the greater the chance that we'd never have to use those weapons. That's called deterrence, and it worked. Any soldier can understand that concept, and that's how we explained it to them.
Until the 1990s, there were 120 similar storage sites throughout Germany. The artillery shells were intended to stop Soviet tank forces. The shells had a range of 20 to 30 kilometers, so they would have been fired only on German soil. This footage shows one such small nuclear explosion.
There were nuclear anti-aircraft missiles and even nuclear mines. There were all sorts of crazy weapons during the Cold War period. If you look back at that today, you'd think the world had gone insane, because those weapons represented absolute self-destruction. There were nuclear landmines on the border between East and West Germany, and the Nike Hercules air defense missile system, equipped with nuclear warheads.
If NATO nuclear artillery had been used against Soviet tank units, it would almost certainly have caused serious damage to the surrounding German countryside. But times changed, and NATO commanders eventually decided to revise their strategy.
They have largely moved away from tactical nuclear weapons. And the reason they moved away is because the military didn't need them to solve their military objectives. They could use advanced conventional weapons for this instead. So now we are hearing recommendations that the U.S. needs to reintroduce tactical or tactical-like nuclear weapons with low yield.
This museum in the town of Damen, in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, is dedicated to troops of the East German rocket forces. Hans Christensen stops by to inspect some of the equipment and is given details about how the missiles were deployed that even he didn't know. The museum was set up by former members of the 5th Rocket Brigade. They've restored some of the old Cold War-era transport vehicles, which looked like trucks and hid the short-range ballistic missiles perfectly. Christensen points out that today, tactical, that is, short-range weapons, are still a key component of Russia's nuclear arsenal.
It's very much a difference in tactics. The point is that the Russian military relies more on tactical nuclear weapons because their conventional forces are considered far less capable. So Russia has a conventional inferiority, if you will, and so they use tactical nuclear weapons to compensate for that. So we see in the Russian Navy a large use of tactical nuclear weapons for anti-ship cruise missiles, torpedoes, depth charges, you name it. The U.S. military has completely phased out those types of weapons. It doesn't need them anymore because it has better conventional forces.
Some experts say that the fact that Russia is economically weaker than the U.S. is part of why Moscow continues to rely on tactical nuclear weapons. So has the risk of a limited nuclear conflict in Europe increased?
We have many statements from Russian military and political leaders that they're prepared to employ nuclear weapons on a limited basis in a war against NATO. Is war between Russia and NATO likely? I don't think so. Is it completely out of the question? I wish that it were, but it's not. So how likely the risk of limited nuclear war is today is very difficult to calibrate. But relative to the peaceful period we lived in the 1990s and the decade afterwards, it's higher.
NATO is actively preparing to deal with the threat of a low-yield nuclear attack. We asked Professor Ischinger what he thinks of tactical nuclear weapons.
Not much, because they're nothing more than a rehash of proposals put forward during the Cold War. At that time, there was also talk about miniaturized nuclear weapons and portable nuclear weapons, which a soldier could carry half a kilometer across the border, set up, and then detonate by remote control. All these things could do more to promote and escalate conflicts than to prevent them.
NATO has repeatedly expressed its concern about Moscow's recent deployment of mobile short-range nuclear-capable missiles in the Kaliningrad region, a strip of Russian territory between Poland and Lithuania. The missile's range extends almost to Berlin. In June 2018, NATO held a training exercise in the Baltic states and Poland. 19 NATO states and partners, including France, took part.
From a military standpoint, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to defend the Baltic states against a Russian attack involving armored divisions and tens of thousands of troops.
German soldiers also took part in the NATO exercise. Here, red units defend themselves against an attack by blue units. It's strategically better to wait than to fire blindly and give away your position.
We engaged the enemy infantry and took out quite a few of them. I redeployed my men in a stream bed, which is a good defensive position. Right now, we're waiting for the next enemy attack, which they are probably preparing right now.
Germany is leading a NATO force in Lithuania that involves 1,200 troops from 10 member states. The units were sent to strengthen the alliance's defenses along Europe's border with Russia.
We train together with the NATO battle group and, of course, with our Lithuanian allies.
How much territory can you actually defend here?
Right now, a strip of land about 10 kilometers wide.
10 kilometers is not much in the grand scheme of things.
Enemy probably at platoon strength. Attackers driven back.
But what is the true purpose of these NATO exercises?
They're there more to reassure the Balts than to threaten the Russians. And if the current status is maintained, I don't think that a lot of people in Russia will be losing sleep over a few battalions of NATO forces in the Baltic states.
I think that many of the predictions about what could happen in the Baltics are exaggerated. I don't believe Vladimir Putin is waiting for the opportunity to bring the region back to Russia in some sort of glorious battle. Because if he were, then honestly, the uncertainty Donald Trump introduced into the Western alliance would have been the moment for Russia to strike. But they didn't. So I don't think there's any serious danger of war in the Baltic states at the present time.
In the 1970s, the Soviet Union deployed SS-20 intermediate-range nuclear missiles in European Russia. These weapons were capable of hitting targets in most of Western Europe. European politicians demanded a response. And NATO proposed stationing nuclear-capable Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe. The Soviet Union feared that this deployment could lead to a NATO first strike. Millions of people across Europe demonstrated against what appeared to be a new round in the arms race. The protests in Germany were the largest since the end of World War II. In the end, instead of a strike, there was a handshake. In October 1986, U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in Reykjavik to sign a treaty that would eliminate all U.S. and Soviet land-based short-range and intermediate-range missiles. This was the so-called INF Treaty. By 1991, the two sides had eliminated a total of nearly 2,700 missiles. Some of the cruise missiles that were eliminated under terms of the agreement had been stored at facilities like this in Germany. Hans Christensen says the treaty was unprecedented in its scope.
It was the first agreement that simply eradicated an entire class of missiles. What was also important was that it had a very strong verification regime with on-site inspections, both at the sites, launch sites, but also at factories and what have you. So it was a really important new way of doing arms control. Many saw that sort of later as a first step toward elimination of nuclear weapons globally.
This is Nature One, an open-air electronic music festival held every August at the site of a decommissioned U.S. cruise missile base near the town of Kastellaun in western Germany. But the missiles removed from this base are once again causing tensions. In October 2018, President Trump said Russia had been cheating on the INF Treaty.
Russia has violated the agreement. They've been violating it for many years, and I don't know why President Obama didn't negotiate or pull out. And we're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to. We're the ones that have stayed in the agreement, and we've honored the agreement, but Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement. So we're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out. That's the INF? Yeah, the INF.
President Trump's statement shocked the world. In February 2019, Russia announced it would also suspend the INF Pact. But even before that, Washington was concerned that Russia had been testing a new ground-launched cruise missile and a new ballistic missile, similar to these.
Ich befürchte, dass sich auf beiden Seiten, also auf russischer
I'm concerned that on both the American and the Russian side, the hardliners could prevail. These are people who believe the best course of action is to out-arm the other side.
Es gibt Leute in Russland,
There are military experts in Russia who believe that given the overall strategic balance of power, Russia has no choice but to increase its reliance on nuclear weapons.
Gar keine Wahl hat, als sich noch stärker als in der Vergangenheit auf nukleare Waffen abzustützen. Und das möglicherweise der
And that if a conflict develops, using nuclear weapons early on could force the West to desist and end such a conflict, which is a very high-risk strategy in my opinion.
Das sind aus meiner Sicht sehr gefährliche Überlegungen.
Some experts say that the U.S. decided to suspend its participation in the INF Treaty so that it could deal with an increasingly aggressive China.
I think it has less to do with NATO. Frankly speaking, I think it has more to do with China, because China has a lot of intermediate range forces. And Russia has a lot of other forces in this part of Europe that they can use to target anything they want in Europe anyway. So it doesn't really make militarily sense here.
At the same time, Russia says NATO is cheating on the INF agreement by deploying missile defense systems in Romania and Poland. U.S. Navy ships outfitted with anti-missile interceptors are on duty in the Mediterranean Sea. Washington says all of these systems are intended to protect against missile attacks from Iran.
The Russians say that the U.S. missile defense systems in Eastern Europe are a violation of the INF Treaty. Experts disagree on whether that's true. But in any case, the treaty is in a pretty sorry state right now.
Well, there are mutual accusations from the United States and Russia about the other side violating the treaty. The best way, of course, would be for both sides to sit down and discuss. I hear that experts would need no more than a couple of weeks to fix the whole thing. But in the current political crisis, in the current political situation between the United States and Russia, it looks like virtually impossible, which is very sad because we may be losing that treaty within a year.
In 2018, the Trump administration released the latest version of the Nuclear Posture Review, which outlines the Pentagon's plans for modernizing America's nuclear arsenal as a deterrent to both nuclear and non-nuclear aggression. The plan, in part, calls for the deployment of new or updated versions of cruise missiles to be based on submarines. The U.S. could deploy the missiles without having to ask its NATO allies. And some experts say that this could cause political friction.
What's tricky about the plan is that if the U.S. were to deploy its own cruise missiles on its own submarines, it would circumvent getting NATO approval. Precisely because the U.S. knows full well that such a one-sided move would upset the other NATO partners.
I'm quite concerned that U.S. policy may end up in the hands of those who believe that Russian violations of the INF Treaty mean Washington must now also develop new intermediate-range nuclear weapons. That would be the death of the agreement.
So if the INF Treaty collapses, you will have no treaty or system governing medium-range ballistic missiles and nuclear missiles and cruise missiles in Europe. These weapons are specifically a danger and risk to Europeans because the range holds European cities and capitals at risk. So while this treaty is between the US and Russia, it really affects Europeans.
President Trump's frequent verbal attacks on NATO have raised grave concerns. Some experts are no longer certain that the U.S. nuclear umbrella is still committed to protecting Europe, or if America would come first in a crisis. Here, a NATO delegation is inspecting a French nuclear submarine. Could alliance members strengthen nuclear policy cooperation so as to reduce their reliance on the U.S.? Would it be possible for Europe to develop its own nuclear weapons?
There is a loophole that might allow for that. In 1969, the new West German Chancellor Willy Brandt signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But he did so with the caveat that a future European political alliance might be allowed to consider the development of nuclear weapons.
If France were in that alliance, it might be possible, at least in theory, for Germany to become a nuclear power.
I don't want to completely rule out the possibility that if a European defense union were to be developed along the lines we have proposed, that organization might also have nuclear power, thanks largely to French nuclear capability.
But recent polls indicate that more than 70% of Germans are opposed to the development, possession, deployment, and use of nuclear weapons. And some experts agree with those sentiments.
That would be a massive mistake to try to reintroduce such a weapon in Europe, because then we're truly back in sort of the dynamic of the Cold War.
I think the Cold War made it clear that an increase in nuclear weapons does not enhance security, but ultimately increases insecurity on both sides.
The sides don't trust each other. And that's a tremendously dangerous situation to be in, considering the destructive power of these thousands and thousands of weapons systems.
Nuclear weapons are once again making headlines in Europe, whether it's low-yield devices or cruise missiles on submarines. If the hardliners on all sides gain the upper hand, it could mean the end of a relatively peaceful period in modern European history.